There we go. Okay. Let's do this one more time. Okay, so thank you everybody so much for being here tonight. My name is Curtis. I'm the owner of Funk Coffee Bar and House of Funk Roasting. Fussler can't be here tonight, so I am going to be your fake MC. I'm going to do the best that I can. And because Fussler isn't here tonight, we don't have as many bribes and giveaways as we usually do, but as always, we are sponsored by Bitcoin Well, Coinos, Coin Cards, and of course, Funk Coffee Bar. Yeah, and just a little bit about myself. We have this beautiful cafe here. I've been trying to make it available for all different types of communities, including, of course, the Bitcoin community. And, we started doing events here for Bitcoin just over a year ago. And I think that this is our 8th one that we've done in the coffee bar. And so it's been awesome. And thank you so much for coming out as always. So tonight we got a very special talk for you. We have Seb Bunney hailing all the way from Squamish, BC. And I think you were in town for Web Summit. That's obviously a big tech conference that's been happening in town. And the funny thing about Web Summit is that Web Summit is all about kind of pushing, putting on display all of the very disruptive technologies that exist within our world today. Of course, things like AI, things on the biotech front, all across the board. And when you actually go down and look at the programming for Web Summit, I did this a few weeks ago, there is zilch about Bitcoin. And so that's really fascinating to me because a lot of people, there's probably a lot of new faces in this room, but there's a lot of people that have been here before that kind of think that this is probably one of the most important technological, economic revolutions that is happening in our lifetime. So I'm hoping that tonight, I do see some badges for Web Summit, and thank you so much for being here. And Seb's going to be giving a chat today about Bitcoin and authenticity. And so again, this is going to be live stream on YouTube if you want to catch it later on BTCVAN's channel. Without further ado, let's welcome Seb to the stage.
I think, first off, I just want to say, when it comes to Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is truly decentralized, its success is basically on the shoulders of the individuals. And it is people like Curtis and it's people like Funk Coffee that allow these little events to take place and for community to come together and ideas to grow and businesses to thrive. And so, again, I just want a quick round of applause to Funk for having us, because this is awesome. So I think sometimes it's hard to ground the conversation of money in reality and talk about how it impacts us as individuals. So the conversation that I really want to kind of bring about today is just how money is disconnecting us as individuals, how it is impacting how we show up as individuals. And so we're going to talk about this kind of journey from survival to sovereignty and how money can really support us and ultimately how Bitcoin can support us as individuals. And hopefully by the end of this, we, rather than being disconnected, we'll be reconnecting, thinking a little bit more about how we can show up more authentically and show up pursuing the things that motivate us most. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a story. My background, I was a backcountry mountain bike coach for over a decade. I absolutely loved teaching, coaching, bringing people into the mountains and spending time in nature, helping people along their journey of understanding their body and being able to mountain bike and experience these amazing places. And there was one specific group that I took out. It's a group of about 15 people of unbelievably influential people that own some of the businesses you guys may be familiar with. And there was one guy in particular, one evening we sat down and he said to me, he was just like, when it comes to goal setting, most of us around the world build all of our goals around the 3 Ps. And if you can't see this, it is prestige, power, and possessions. All of our goal setting is around, we want the newest job. We want people to look up to us. We want the Lamborghini. But the reality is, if we hit pause for a second and ask yourself, what are the moments that actually are really meaningful? What have been my most kind of awe-inspiring moments throughout my life? And they're not the 3 Ps. They're not prestige, power, and possessions. Instead, they are actually the 3 Cs, which is connections, contributions, and challenges. It's when we connect to other people. It's when we build community, when we build relationships that are fulfilling. It's when we contribute back to society, when we create value, when we show up more wholeheartedly. And it's when we challenge ourselves, when we push ourselves outside of our comfort zone, and we do things that allow us to grow as individuals. And so we have this world where we're building all of our goals around prestige, power, and possessions, but it's actually connections, contributions, and challenges which make us feel whole. And so this kind of got me asking the question, and I've been asking this question for a long time now, which is, what is it about society today that makes people want to look for a way out? They want to try and fill this void with things and stuff and power and prestige, rather than look for a way in, to challenge themselves, to build community, to look inwards and understand how they want to show up. And so this is what I kind of want to discuss in this presentation. So we're going to start with kind of where we went wrong as a society, some of the challenges we're facing in society today. Then we're going to touch on what are the repercussions of where we went wrong, and then ultimately, how do we reconnect? And let's obviously start with where we went wrong. So let's first start with just our economy. How does our economy work? Where did we go wrong? Well, in a very simple model of how our economy works, there's 4 levers in society. The first lever is the land lever. The land lever is all of our natural resources. It's the lumber in the forests. It's the minerals in the ground. It's the fossil fuels in the ground. It's the fish and the food in the oceans. It's the land that allows us to thrive and creates all of the goods that we need. We then have the labor lever. The labor lever is us as individuals. It's our ability to use our energy, our minds, to create stuff. We're able to use our labor to come together to create buildings, to create companies. We then have the capital lever, which is obviously our ability to communicate through value, to be able to purchase stuff, goods and services. And then finally, we have the enterprise lever, which is the use of labor, land, and capital to create value, to innovate, to create new companies and technology that changes the world in which we're in. So these 4 kind of buckets that make up our economy, ultimately, we can create change in any of those, and it helps boost GDP, it helps boost our economy overall. But the problem is, out of those 4 levers, 3 of them create what's called indirect change. 1 of them can directly impact our economy, and so we end up leaning on that lever. What do I mean by that? These 3 levers, land, labor, and enterprise, if we want to make change in our economy through the land lever, what do we have to do? Well, we have to go find resources. We've got to find gold. We've got to find oil. We've got to find more natural minerals to be able to kind of create the chips, the silicon, you name it. The challenge with that is there's so much regulation, it impedes us from doing so. On top of that, we've scoured Earth trying to find these resources, so it's hard to come by large gold reserves or large oil reserves that are materially going to change the trajectory of a nation or globally. It's the same thing with labor. In order to be able to create a more productive society, we have to lower the average age of the workforce. It's really hard to do that. We've got to have more kids. We're in a world today where, because of the financial pressures, no one is having kids, or very few people are having kids. And you look at countries like China, which have, because of their one-child policy, they're expected to see their population half up until 2050. That's mind-blowing. So what they're seeing is an aging average population rather than a kind of a younger generation coming up. And so that makes life much harder. The younger population have to support the elderly. And then finally, enterprise. Again, we can hope that technology creates change. Well, technology takes a long time to create change. We're just seeing the benefits of AI today. AI started in the 60s. It's taken us 50, 60 plus years to get to where we are today. So if we want to create new technology that is able to change our trajectory, it takes a long time. So then we're left with 1 lever in society, which is the capital lever. It's really easy to hit print on the money printer, and all of a sudden you inject capital into the economy and change takes place. And as a result of this, governments have recognized, hey, if we want to create change easily, why don't we just keep pulling the capital lever? And we can keep stimulating the economy. The problem is we have the law of diminishing returns. The more money you print, the less of a difference it makes. The more debt we take on, life starts to get harder. And in the extreme cases, we end up in places like Venezuela, where it was 14.6 million bolivars to buy this chicken. And 1 month after this photo was taken, it was 30 million bolivars. So that's what happens when you pull the monetary lever. As the money supply grows, what it buys shrinks. So life starts to get harder. And unfortunately, Canada is actually no different. We're not to the same extent yet, but we're no different in that we have printed more money in the last 10 years. So those that can't see this, we've printed more money in the last 10 years than the previous 150 years combined. I think a lot of people don't necessarily recognize this, and you wonder, why does life seem to be getting harder? Why are prices rising at the same rate, like a rate that we've never really felt before? And it's no wonder that the average house in Canada used to, in the 1970s, take 3 years of the average person's wage to go and purchase. Today, in 2025, it takes 9.7 years. So it's a lot harder to get by. Because we're printing money, people, they're not going to store their savings in money. They're going to move to things like real estate. They're going to move to things like farmland to store value. As a result, because there's more demand, prices rise. Life starts to get harder. And it's the same thing. If you wanted to buy one share of the S&P 500, the 500 biggest companies in the US, if you want to buy one share, in 1970, it was 24 hours of the average Canadian's average hourly wage in Canada. Today it takes 251 hours. So it is significantly harder because of the rising cost of living, the declining purchasing power of the Canadian dollar. And one final statistic, 74.8% of Canadians and Americans live paycheck to paycheck. So as a result of these rising prices, where life is getting harder, people are on the breadline. People are effectively spending their paycheck by the time it comes around to the next paycheck. They're not able to save. They're not able to get ahead. It's wild. It is wild to see this taking place. And so this brings us to the next question. If we understand where we went wrong, we've been pulling the capital lever. We've been printing money to try and stimulate change in the economy, as opposed to focusing on the land, the labor, and the enterprise lever. We've been focused on the monetary lever. And so now let's take a look at what are the repercussions of this. And this is where I think it is really fascinating. And I hope this is not too doom and gloom, because in the end, I believe we have a very bright future. But anyway, you guys may be familiar in psychology with something called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is kind of this 5-tier pyramid, and at the base, you have your physiological needs or your survival needs. And that's like food, warmth, shelter, and then as you start going up, you get into things like belongingness and love, relationship needs. You then get into self-esteem needs up higher, which is this feeling sense of accomplishment, being able to support others in your community. And then finally, you have like self-actualization, the pinnacle, which is more spiritual progression, morality, creativity, and that's when we really have time and capacity to show up in life. The problem we're facing today is that because money is losing purchasing power, we're getting stuck on the bottom rung. We're getting stuck as a society on the bottom rung where we're trying to meet our basic survival needs, food and shelter. And it becomes very hard for us to start thinking about belongingness, esteem needs, self-actualization. And so today, because of money deteriorating, because our purchasing power is deteriorating, it's impacting the health of the economy, the health of the individual. It's impacting us psychologically as to how we show up as individuals. And so this is a quote from one of my favorite books. I was, as well as my interest in mountain biking and coaching, I also went down the rabbit hole of becoming what's called a somatic therapist. And the idea behind somatic therapy is that our nervous system tells a story, and we can hold a lot of tension in the body, and it can create a lot of illness and sickness. And this book is called The Body Keeps the Score. It's all about how stress impacts the body. But this, to me, is a very profound statement, which is, if an organism is stuck in survival mode, its energies are focused on fighting off unseen enemies, which leaves no room for nurture, care, and love. For us humans, it means that as long as the mind is defending itself against invisible assaults, our closest bonds are threatened, along with our ability to imagine, to play, to plan, to play, to learn, and to pay attention to other people's needs. So the way I interpret this is that when we are stuck because of our current financial position, when the average person is basically just trying to get by and put food on the table or a roof over their heads, all of a sudden, we don't have the capacity to be able to think about or to imagine, to plan, to play, to learn, to pay attention to other people's needs. So you have a society that's becoming increasingly disconnected. And so it's really important for us to think about, like, how can we alter course? How can we change trajectory? And so when I think about money and inflation and rising prices, what it's very evident is that it's taking up more of our mind share. It's taking up our ability to focus on other stuff because we're simply thinking about survival. Not only that, if we're interested in all of these other things, whereas family, sports, career, all of a sudden, not only do we have to direct our attention to those things, but we have to direct our attention to, if we do have savings, how do I even protect my savings? So now everyone has to become an expert investor. We've got to figure out the real estate market, figure out the equity market. And most of us don't want to do that. Most of us want to focus on what motivates us rather than focusing on how do I protect my purchasing power. Most of us don't want to become expert investors. So the result of this mind share being consumed by thinking about money is that we are seeing repercussions in so many different areas. So this is kind of like 4 main areas, but I would argue that it's in almost every area of life. You're starting to see the share of US 30-year-olds who live on their own has dropped from 90% in 1983 to below 65% today. It's the same thing, have ever married, 80% down below 50%. Live with a child, from 60% down close to 30%. Own a home, we're now at like close to 30% of 30-year-olds. There's another chart that's not on here that is the baby boomer generation at the average age of 30 owned 35% of the housing market. The millennial generation at the average age of 30 owns 3% of the housing market. So life is getting challenging because of rising prices. And so when money fails to store value, we look for a way out rather than a way in. And that is we disconnect from ourselves. We disconnect from our communities. And you start to see nihilism, you start to see depression, anxiety, substance abuse, which is what we see in society today. So that brings us to the final kind of stage, which is how do we reconnect as a society? And I think this is so important. How do we reconnect? How do we alter course from the current course or our current trajectory? I'm going to start by saying that it is no longer about saving. You can save in Canadian dollars. It's not going to do much. My friend inherited $100,000 from her grandparents. When was it? 10 years ago, 11 years ago? And she didn't know what to do with that $100,000. Well, she still has that $100,000 in a bank account. And house prices have tripled since then. So what's actually happened is what her $100,000 could buy back then effectively can now only purchase $33,000. She's lost 66% of her purchasing power. And so life is so unbelievably hard when prices are rising in relation to your money. So we've got to think about not just saving, but what we're actually saving in. And that is the most important part. Now, if we want to save in something, we've got to ensure that it's outperforming other assets so that life starts to get easier. Well, over the last 5 years, if we'd saved in wheat, we actually would have outperformed the Canadian dollar. The best one on there, which has outperformed real estate, has outperformed stocks, is actually cocoa. So if you guys want to invest in something, you should invest in cocoa. Cocoa's gone up 287% over the last 5 years. But there's been one asset which has outperformed everything, and I'm sure you guys can probably guess what that is. It's Ethereum. No, it's Bitcoin. Bitcoin has gone up 2,400%, which is 10 times that of the second best performing asset. And what is amazing about that is that when you save in an asset that is going up faster than everything else, the other way to look at it is when you're looking at the world through the lens of Bitcoin, everything else is getting cheaper in Bitcoin. So whether you want to buy other assets, you want to put a roof over your head, whether you want to buy real estate, whether you want to buy food and put it on the table, life starts to get cheaper when you're looking at the world through the lens of Bitcoin. And it's hard to wrap your head around, but you can use Bitcoin as your unit of account, and it's profound to see. And so when we start looking at things like real estate, previously, if you remember, real estate in Canada from 1970 to present day has gone from 3 times the average person's wage to 9.7 times the average person's wage. Well, Bitcoin hasn't been around since 1970, so we don't have that comparison. But what we do have is from 2014, the average house in Canada was 402,000 Canadian dollars, and up to 2025, it's gone to 717. So almost a double. Well, in Bitcoin, it's gone from 1,054 Bitcoin to 8. So you've seen a 99% drop in house prices when you're looking at the world through the lens of Bitcoin. That's a profound experience if you are that Bitcoiner who is saving in Bitcoin. Life starts to become easier. The benefits of that are numerous. And this is a result of kind of three main characteristics, I would say. The first is Bitcoin is trustless and permissionless. This is really important. We need a monetary system where capital can flow to where value is being created. As individuals, if I believe in something, I want to direct my capital towards that thing. We've seen, like during the pandemic, we had the trucker rally, and those that were protesting against the government, because the government didn't agree with it, they ordered the banks to freeze people's accounts. So people basically had their capital frozen, they couldn't survive just because the government didn't agree with what they were protesting about. So it's really important to have a system that is permissionless. You don't need to ask for permission to spend your money. On top of that, it is trustless in that you do not need to rely, if you don't want to, on third parties, intermediaries. You can look after Bitcoin yourself. Secondly, Bitcoin is decentralized. This is unbelievably important. Our current system, there is a small cabal of individuals that govern our monetary system so they can print and expand the monetary supply at will, usually at the expense of the individual, nearly always at the expense of the individual. And so we need a system that is built upon rules instead of rulers. Everyone plays by the same rules. And that is the case with Bitcoin. There'll be 21 million, and we know that if you owned one of 21 million today, in 20 years' time, you can be confident that you're going to own one of 21 million. And so having a decentralized system distributes that trust. Again, you're not relying on any intermediary or any individual or single party. And then finally, and I would argue the most important thing, is Bitcoin is scarce. Now, Bitcoin, the supply is, we will have fully mined the supply in 2140, and we will have just shy of 21 million Bitcoin. But what is most important about this, and Jeff Booth talks about this in his book, The Price of Tomorrow, is that our natural state of things is deflation. Humans, since the dawn of time, have always been striving to get more for less. If we think about, take an apple. 150 years ago, to be able to have an apple in your hand, that apple first would have had to, the soil would have been tilled by hand by a farmer. And then, well, they could only grow for 3-4 months of the year. They didn't really have fertilizers, they didn't really have any form of pesticides. They had to monitor that crop like the whole time. And then on top of that, to bring that crop to market, it was very hard to do that, horse and cart. You could only sell to a small local area. Well, today, we now have greenhouses we can grow year-round. We have pesticides, we have fertilizers to amplify the yield of that crop. On top of that, we have transport planes. We can sell globally. We have a global market. Yet, the cost of an apple has gone up 1,500% over the last 100 or so years. So why is the cost of something going up, yet our efficiency in being able to create yield or create more of this thing becomes exponentially easier? And it's because, unfortunately, the money supply is growing quicker than technology is advancing. And so when you have a monetary system built upon a fixed supply, as we become more efficient in technology, as we produce more goods and services, life starts to get easier. Prices fall in relation to that currency as we've seen previously. So under a Bitcoin world, under a Bitcoin standard, all of a sudden, into the future, prices fall in relation to Bitcoin. Life gets easier. And so scarcity, decentralization, trustlessness, and permissionlessness are unbelievably important, and they're the characteristics which make Bitcoin what it is. So as Jeff Booth says, abundance in money equals scarcity in everything else. When we have a monetary system where we can print endless amounts of money, that money loses value. Well, people aren't just going to simply save in the money. What are they going to do? They're going to go save in other assets. So they start saving in things like real estate. They start saving in things like farmland. But they don't use those things for their utility value, which is putting a roof over their head or growing crops and adding value to their community. They're using it for monetary purposes to store value. And for a long time, over a decade, I lived up in Whistler. Whistler is a really interesting place because you have a lot of capital coming in from wealthy individuals. Whistler, 61% of houses are empty in Whistler, yet we have a housing crisis. And it's because the average individual who is invested in Whistler is not using it for its utility purpose, these properties. They're using it purely as a monetary store of value. And that's a result of money not storing value. But under a Bitcoin standard, scarcity in money equals abundance in everything else. When people are incentivized to save because their purchasing power is increasing, all of a sudden, all of that monetary store of value that's in all of these other assets floods back into the money. So all of a sudden, if people in purchasing power is increasing and life starts to get easier, then people are able to pursue the things that create joy because they're saving in a vehicle that actually does its job. And so you have abundance in everything else. People can actually start to afford a house. People can actually afford to feed their kids the food they want to feed them. They can actually pursue the hobbies they want to pursue. And so earlier we looked at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we were looking at it from the perspective that when we have declining purchasing power, we start falling down this pyramid and we get stuck on the base layer because we're trying to put food on the table and a roof over our heads. Well, the nice thing about Bitcoin, and I would argue actually the best thing about Bitcoin, is that it allows us to start moving up the pyramid again. It starts, once we're able to achieve food and shelter, we can start thinking about intimate relationships and friends. We can start thinking about feeling a sense of accomplishments or confidence, respect for oneself, others, even moving up into morality, creativity, spirituality. And so for me, the most profound thing about Bitcoin is it starts to create connection again. It starts to create connection because we can actually focus on the things that matter. And that's something that I think our current system is taking away from people. People are stuck in survival mode. And so while fiat, Canadian dollars, US dollars, New Zealand dollars, are constantly demanding more and more and more of our attention, Bitcoin is returning it so we can actually focus on what matters. I like to say the irony of Bitcoin being digital money is that it allows us to forget about money or stop thinking about money. Our current system, we're hyper fixated on money. We're constantly trying to protect it. We're constantly trying to grow it because life is getting harder and harder. On a Bitcoin standard, we can actually focus on what matters, which is if I want to start a business, I want to run a coffee store, if I want to be a mountain bike instructor, life starts to get easier and I can actually pursue the things that motivate me and make me feel more whole, make me feel like I've got more self-esteem. It allows me to actually spend more time in contemplation and looking inwards. And so I think that under a Bitcoin standard, I would argue that the financial sector would be a fraction of the size it is today because people don't have to worry about trying to protect their purchasing power. And what is amazing is I had a guy reach out to me, a Bitcoiner, this is maybe 2 weeks ago, and we jumped on a call together. And he was a nuclear weapons technician in the US military. And after quite a few years, he's like, what am I doing? I do not feel this is my path. I do not feel this is motivating me as an individual. And more than anything, I would love to do ecological restoration. I would love to support the natural environment, but there's just no way I can ever afford to buy land. Land is too expensive. So anyway, after plucking up the courage, he ended up leaving the military. And after leaving the military, having a little more time on his hands, he found Bitcoin. And then he started to save in Bitcoin. And him and his wife, they put all their hard-earned savings into Bitcoin, and Bitcoin started appreciating. Well, after a few years, he realized that that dream of ecological restoration didn't have to be a dream, and he was able to purchase around 100 acres of land that he could start to ecologically restore. He then developed the skill set of ecological restoration, started a non-profit, and people now invest in the non-profit. He invests that capital in Bitcoin, returns an 8% dividend yield to the investors, and then all of the additional proceeds, given that Bitcoin is growing at like 50 to 60% annualized, goes into ecological restoration, and he's now impacting thousands of acres over the US. So you start to see what was once a dream, it's incredible. And what was once a dream is now a reality. And so when people start looking at the world through the lens of Bitcoin, they start having more capacity to pursue the things that motivate them. And actually, you know what? Jarrett and I were talking to the French Chamber of Commerce or executive group. This was maybe a month ago. And Jarrett shared a story about the silverback gorillas was it the Congo? And what's interesting is the park rangers of this national park, the silverback gorillas are basically coming into extinction. There's not many silverback gorillas. They have to be protected from poachers. And they're reliant on tourism. What's amazing about Bitcoin is when the pandemic hit, all of a sudden that tourism dropped off. The park rangers didn't have the capital to be able to basically survive. And so it opened up basically the doors for poachers. Well, Bitcoiners came in because Bitcoin was able to turn something like a waterway into a hydro dam. They were able to start to monetize local energy, create an alternative resource stream other than tourism to afford the park rangers. So the park rangers now can look after the gorillas without that reliance on tourism. So Bitcoin is allowing these people to focus on what matters. Focus on the things that are actually making a difference in this world. Focusing on the community, focusing on nature, focusing on just showing up in life more authentically. And for me as an individual, I have noticed that immensely. Like as I've gone down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, I came into it from, hey, I just need to make a quick buck. This thing, hopefully it will go up. And this was 6-7 years ago now. And now I'm in it because of the revolution, that it's allowing people, it's giving them back capacity, giving them back attention span to focus on what matters. And it's allowed me to focus on education. It's allowed me to focus on being involved in my community and not constantly trying to just survive. So to kind of wrap things up, we started on the 3 Ps and the 3 Cs. Prestige, power, and possessions is what we're stuck at in society. People are looking for a way out rather than a way in. Well, I would argue that on Bitcoin, all of a sudden, when we have money that successfully stores value, rather than looking for a way out, we look for a way in. We look for a way in to deepen our relationship with self because we have more capacity. We look for a way in to deepen our relationship with community. And we try to figure out what actually motivates me as an individual. How can I show up more authentically? And so Bitcoin, to me, is a spiritual tool. Bitcoin is one of the most profound spiritual tools we've ever had because it gets us to stop thinking about money and focus on what matters in life. And so I think that is so, so important. And that's where, for me, that's where I like to have the conversation. We get so stuck on the macroeconomic side of things, the monetary side of things. And it's like, Bitcoin to me is a spiritual tool that allows us to show up more authentically. So anyway, I just really appreciate everyone coming along. And if you want to learn more about this stuff, my Twitter is Seb Bunney with an EY. I do have a blog at sebbunny.com. And I wrote a book called The Hidden Cost of Money, which talks about a lot of these issues. How money is kind of pervasive throughout society and it's impacting how we show up as individuals. And so I think it's really important to understand that money is more than just a medium of exchange. It's impacting how we show up as individuals psychologically, it's impacting our capacity. And then finally, I work for a company called Block Rewards based out of Kelowna, and we're all about getting people paid in Bitcoin. So if you're a corporate entity or a company that wants to pay their employees in Bitcoin, we can do that. But anyway, I really appreciate it, and I can open up for questions. Any questions?
Quantum computers.
So the question was like, is there a threat to Bitcoin with quantum computing? And being absolutely transparent, it's not necessarily my area of expertise, but I'll share what I do know. What I do know is that Bitcoin has come a long way from the first transactions that Satoshi made way back in 2009, 2010. And so there's a lot of wallets, these more legacy addresses, that are encrypted in a much weaker form than our current forms of encryption. And so it's not as if the moment we have quantum computing, Bitcoin is going to be wiped out. We're going to start to see certain legacy wallets be cracked well before we start to see current encryption standards cracked. And so I would say that that's kind of like the canary in the coal mine, and we haven't seen that yet from my understanding. But I wouldn't say that's necessarily my area of expertise, so I can't comment from an in-depth expert perspective.
Can Bitcoin be reprogrammed to meet that?
Yeah. And so that's the other thing, is like Bitcoin, I say Bitcoin, if you have one Bitcoin today of 21 million, in 20 years' time, you can still have one Bitcoin of 21 million. But Bitcoin is a consensus mechanism. So if the community decided we wanted 42 million Bitcoin, which they're not going to, given that the incentives don't align for that, because people wouldn't devalue their worth, we could change that rule set. But it's the same thing. If people feel that quantum computing is a threat to the code, then the community, through the consensus mechanism, can create change. And there's a few different ways that that can take place as well. Yeah. So the question was around kind of like the funding of developers. We've got the Ethereum Foundation, which obviously funds development. It's a challenging one because there's obviously a threat to also having something like the Ethereum Foundation. The Ethereum Foundation kind of governs the trajectory of Ethereum, and what we have seen is as investors who invested in Ethereum, the monetary policy has changed so many times that if you'd invested in Ethereum in 2014 when it came out, or 2016, or 2018, the rule set has changed so many times that there's no predictability. And with that lack of predictability, it becomes very hard to plan for the future. And so I think that it's kind of like the same issue that we're facing in the fiat currency world, which is if as an individual, I'm like, you know what, I want to buy a house. And I think that house is going to take me 15 years to save on my current wage. Well, if 5 years into that 15 years, the house now takes 25 years, it's like, what am I doing? This is so frustrating. And I think that's what's taking place in Ethereum, not necessarily just from purchasing price, but as an individual, you may have an understanding about how Ethereum functions, its rule set, and then a year later, 2 years later, it's completely changed. And so I think that when you have a centralized overseeing body, you have its own centralization risks. Adding to that, we do have, like Bitwise have BITB, which is their Bitcoin ETF in the US, and they donate, I think, 10% of all profits towards Bitcoin developers. And so we have a wealth of, or a swath of Bitcoin developers in various different companies, non-profits that are developing on top of Bitcoin from different perspectives, but there's no centralized foundation. And so there is a ton of development taking place. There's a lot of entities that are like the Human Rights Foundation that are giving away millions of dollars in grants to developers and individuals that are working in Bitcoin. But I think that having that distributed network is really important. And I think that it's whether it's Bitwise, whether it's Human Rights Foundation, whether it is some other corporate entity that wants to donate to development, having those various entities, a distributed network of individuals choosing where they think value is being created, I think is really important as well. Yeah. Can I tie Bitcoin to each of the 5 levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? 1 second, where is it? I would say that you're comparing apples to oranges. I think that, in my mind, Bitcoin is just money. That's all that is. It's just money. And money is life force. And the challenge today is when we're using money that is losing value over time, our life force is constantly being diminished. So we can only focus on the necessities. We don't have the capacity to start thinking outside of ourselves, whether it's community or thinking bigger spiritually. And so I think that what Bitcoin does is it's giving someone life force, it's giving someone capacity so that they can attain these levels much easier. And so it's not necessarily that you need to tie Bitcoin to those things, but it's almost like Bitcoin is recharging your battery. It's giving you more capacity to show up. And I very much believe that when we are in survival mode, our aperture of awareness narrows. We become hyper-fixated on those basic survival needs. We're not thinking about relationships. We're not thinking about all of these other things. I had a friend who, I used to work for Arc'teryx, and one of my buddies that I worked with Arc'teryx with, we were living in Whistler at the time, this is probably about 10 years ago, and he said to me, you know what, like, I'm just gonna live in the moment because I'm never gonna be able to afford a house. I'm not gonna have kids. I'm just, like, what's the point? And he ended up having severe depression, ended up kind of like losing his job, and it was really hard to see this take place. And I would say that, yes, there was probably other factors. Maybe he was predisposed to other mental challenges, but one of those factors is money. Because in Whistler, the average house price is like $3 million. If you're a transient who's coming into Whistler and you're like, this place is phenomenal, I want to kind of set up a bit of a family here, it's like, nope, on $20 an hour, you can't do that. And so I think the challenge we face today in society is that it's very hard for people to pursue what it is that they really want to pursue. So they end up basically being forced into a position where they're simply having to survive as opposed to thrive. And so I would like, just to kind of echo the point again, I think it's not necessarily about tying Bitcoin to each of these levels. I think it's more about looking at Bitcoin through the lens of it's giving you capacity to start moving up that ladder. Because at the moment, people are completely drained trying to meet their basic needs. Yeah.
Do you have any fun market cap projections for us 10, 15, 20 years down the road? I know it's analyzed gold's market cap by about 10%, give or take. But,
So the question was around kind of like market cap projections. And it's a really challenging one because I think sometimes we get distracted by price. But what I would say is that when you have a vehicle that is, its sole purpose is a monetary store of value, I think what we start to see is all of those other assets that are being used as kind of proxy monetary store of value, we're going to see that capital move back into the asset that does it best. And so at the moment, what does this look like? Well, think about real estate in the US. In the US, from 1945 to present day, and this was a chart on Marty Bent, a big Bitcoiner, in his, I think it's called The Bent, a newsletter. He had this a few weeks ago. And they've basically done the math on it, which was in the US in 1945, and hopefully you guys can follow my math here. In 1945, what $1 purchased then, $17.60 purchases now. So we've seen immense inflation. We need $17 to purchase what $1 purchased in 1945. Okay, now let's extrapolate that to housing. Well, the average house in 1945 cost $40,000. $4,000. So if you extrapolate that inflation from 1 to 17 on $4,000, you end up with $70,000. So the average house in the US should cost $70,000, but it doesn't. It costs $530,000. So what is that difference? That difference is a monetary premium of all of these individuals escaping currency, flooding into real estate. And so because money is losing value, people are incentivized to save in other things other than the currency. And so I think that when you look at real estate of $300 trillion globally, when you look at the equity market, $150 trillion globally, the bond market, another $250 to $350 trillion, the derivatives market, $1 quadrillion. Like, we're talking about unbelievable sums of money that is only flooded into those assets simply to store value. I think that most of that capital, 80, 90% of it, if we had a savings vehicle that could simply store value, it would flood back into the savings vehicle. And I think the final point that I'll make is that Bitcoin, I'll make 2 points. One, Bitcoin is like $2 trillion, $3 trillion or so in relation to 300, 400, 500 trillion dollars of assets and all these other things. So it's very, very minor. Two, Bitcoin is significantly outperforming the annualized returns of every other asset class. Even if we were to get full adoption of Bitcoin, Bitcoin was to become fully saturated, how does it then compare against other assets? Well, real estate goes up on average around like 6 to 7% annualized. The stock market is kind of like 8 to 9% depending on how you're looking at it. The bond market is kind of like 4 to 5%. And so you're looking at these assets and they're going up single digits. Well, with Bitcoin, if we had a monetary system and everyone is constantly trying to innovate, a proxy we can look at is what is the average price, what is like falling prices. Well, Jeff Booth talks about how prices fall between 5 to 15%. If we take the middle ground, that's 10%. That means Bitcoin, falling prices, if we had a monetary system that allowed us to save, Bitcoin as a savings vehicle would outperform all of those other traditional asset classes, even if we'd reached full saturation. And so I think you'd be incentivized to save in the currency once again and out of these traditional asset classes. Yeah. Yeah.
Just a question for you. What do you think of the derivative trade in Bitcoin? I've heard from various sources that the daily trade, the dollar value of the daily trade in Bitcoin, derivative trade is almost triple that of the actual underlying coin trade. Right? Do you think this whole run up in the value is just driven by Wall Street's usual shenanigans? Right?
So
there's a huge derivative trade on crypto, actually, Bitcoin and Ethereum.
Absolutely. So the question is around kind of like derivatives trading and how it may be impacting the price of Bitcoin. Yeah. And I think that the thing that's really challenging is that as Bitcoin becomes adopted, we're going to see all of these traditional financial products built on top of Bitcoin. Yeah. So we're going to see the derivatives market rebuilt on top of Bitcoin, which is what we're experiencing now. I would argue that one of the reasons why we didn't see in 2021 in the previous cycle the blow off top that we've seen in other cycles is because derivatives entered the market. And derivatives allow people to take a bet on Bitcoin without owning the underlying asset. And so it created a huge amount of price suppression. We even released the futures markets before we ever had the spot Bitcoin ETFs. And what's really interesting is gold, you guys may be familiar with this, I'm going to use a little bit of an analogy, a side story for a second. Gold in, 1933, had the Executive Order 6102. The US banned the holding of gold. Confiscated all of the holding of gold. You could have a small amount of jewelry, but outside of that, Americans could not hold gold.
Executive order.
And so what ended up happening is they ended up basically buying all of this gold off the general populace, the American citizens, for half the price of the actual market rate, and then they pumped up the price, and what that allowed is them to be able to print a whole bunch of dollars, because at the time the dollar was backed by gold, they were limited in their ability to print money. In 1972, I think it was, after 1971 was the detachment from the gold standard, in 1972, they allowed American citizens to once again own gold. What did they release in the same year? They released the gold futures market. And there's a document from this Department of Defense that says, it's a really interesting document, you can find it online if you want to look it up, it's on WikiLeaks. And it basically says, with the futures market, we're able to artificially create immense amounts of volatility in gold, which dissuades the public from owning gold. And they use the futures market to manipulate the price of gold to dissuade users from holding gold. They released this after they allowed users to hold gold once again. And so I think that the futures market in Bitcoin is creating a lot of the volatility which we're facing today. And you could argue that, I would say that it suppressed the price of Bitcoin in the previous cycle. As for the actual impact of it, I think that it's kind of like Bitcoin's price in its trajectory right now, as we start to see greater adoption, is like holding a ball underwater. You can keep trying to hold it with more and more and more force, but at some point it's going to rocket, and these traditional financial products are going to blow up, because derivatives are obviously, they're incredibly unstable, and we've seen this with the housing crisis, credit default swaps, you name it. I think we're going to see a very quick deleveraging of these derivative products as Bitcoin's price starts to move up. Yeah.
What couple tricks do you have to see the world in Bitcoin? Like, I think brick of water is about 600,000 satoshis, and that's just really hard to get. That's a big number for, you know. What helpful tricks do you have to see the world in the lens of Bitcoin, or measuring value with Bitcoin instead?
Totally. So the question is around, like, what tricks do you have around looking at the world through the lens of Bitcoin? So the first thing, honestly, I would just say, start saving in Bitcoin. When you start, like, it sounds simple, but it's like when you start saving in Bitcoin, all of a sudden, you start questioning the decisions at which you're making, as in like, do I want to purchase this thing? If Bitcoin does what I think it's going to do, well, it's going to be worth 5x, 10x more, and so it really starts to change that decision-making process. I'm going to share, like, or maybe Jarrett, if you're open to it, to share your bicycle story, because you shared it previously.
So a couple of years ago, my wife wanted to buy a road bike, and we had a serious conversation because in order for us to buy the road bike, we'd have to sell Bitcoin to buy the road bike. And so I knew in selling the Bitcoin a couple of years ago, the opportunity cost in that road bike was going to be significant. So I said, wife, are you really going to use this road bike? How badly do you want this? Like, do you want it 3 times what it's worth today badly? Like, how badly, right? So we sold a couple $1,000s of Bitcoin and bought a road bike a couple years ago, and now obviously, you know, that road bike has become pretty expensive for our family to hold. But that was an important conversation for us to have. And I mean, this goes to something that you often talk about, is like, if you start to understand the value of Bitcoin, it causes you to save rather than spend, which has large environmental impacts from the consumer market that we live in today.
No, I really appreciate you sharing that, Jarrett, because I think that Bitcoin changes our mindset. It changes our mindset in that Bitcoin is talk about something called time preference. And on one side of the spectrum, you have what's called high time preference. This is kind of impulsive thinking. I just want to meet my immediate needs. On the other side of the spectrum, you have low time preference, which is, you know what, I'm going to think about the future. I'm going to think about prosperity and security. And I think when you have a vehicle that loses value, the Canadian dollar, all of a sudden its purchasing power is greatest in the present moment. We're incentivized to consume because we can actually buy more right now with the dollar. And this is unconscious. It's not, most people aren't even thinking about this. We just have a very consumption-heavy economy because of the underlying incentives of money. Well, when you have a monetary system that incentivizes you to save, because actually you can purchase more over time, all of a sudden that consumption drops and you start thinking more about, okay, if I save this, maybe I can actually use this to create a company. Maybe I can buy that house that I wanted. Maybe I can do these things that I wanted to do. And so going back to that analogy that I had about the house previously, where if I did the math right now, I think it's going to take me 15 years, and then 5 years in, it's 25 years. That leads to a lot of depression, frustration, meaninglessness. Well, in Bitcoin, it's the opposite. It's, hey, if I look at my income right now, and I think that house is going to take me 15 years to save for a down payment, and then 5 years in, I'm like, oh man, it's going to be 10 years. All of a sudden, that creates a huge sense of hope. It completely changes who we are and how we show up. And so I think that the simplest thing to do to change our mindset around Bitcoin and looking at the world through the lens of Bitcoin is actually just to start saving in Bitcoin. Because you start to see your purchasing power increase. And so every time you go to purchase something, you're like, you weigh up the cost-benefit analysis. And so I'd say that's probably the simplest way. Yeah. So the question was around, like, when it comes to, well, it wasn't necessarily a question, it was a statement, which is our current fiat system, you have a monetary system that is losing value, and so incentivizes spending. If you have a monetary system whose purchasing power is increasing, it disincentivizes spending, so it could contract the economy. And I would say, on the face of it, I agree with you in today's world. When you have an inflationary system with unbelievable amounts of debt, if all of a sudden you have a deflationary currency, well, if you have a debt-based system, those two things don't jive. You're going to have a financial collapse, because over time, it's going to be harder and harder for people to make their debt payments. And so in today's world, absolutely, that does not work. But I think if we were to look forward, let's say we were to jump forward 100 years and the world is operating on Bitcoin, what I think will take place is that people are going to be far less incentivized to take on debt. Because if you're a company and you're looking at the opportunity cost of like, okay, if I take on this debt, I have to ensure that the return on that debt outperforms the purchasing power increase of that currency. And so it makes people a lot more fiscally responsible. And that's the problem in today's society. And we were actually talking, Curtis and I, about this earlier, which is when you have a monetary system where it's almost impossible to be able to save in the local currencies, everyone's pushed into these higher risk investments, we start to see movement of capital away from value-creating companies and towards growth, because everyone's trying to just, it's hope. It's hope that maybe this will be my lottery ticket. Well, on a Bitcoin standard, if Bitcoin is appreciating, this is down the line, if Bitcoin's appreciating at 5 to 50 or 15% a year, well, that's now going to be your hurdle rate. So it's like, if I'm not going to use that capital in anything that's going to underperform 15% a year, so people are a lot more fiscally conscious about where they put their capital. And I think that if people do want to start a business, they have a lot more skin in the game. And so although we may not see as many startups, I think we have much more stability in the startup realm because people aren't taking as much risk. There's not so much debt. And so I think it just it changes the dynamic of the venture corporate world. Yeah.
Your thoughts on the social impacts of politicians getting behind Bitcoin and the coupling of the politicians' political viewpoints and its relationship to that Bitcoin?
So I think the first thing is that if I were to put on my toxic Bitcoin hat, it would be like Bitcoin doesn't care about politicians. In that, as Bitcoin starts to appreciate, people that are struggling see Bitcoin as appreciate, they're going to start investing in Bitcoin and saving in Bitcoin. And what is interesting is as they start moving away from the local currency, the fiat currency, that currency starts to lose value. So I think that as more people start using Bitcoin, it actually starts to suck power out of the traditional system. Now, what is really interesting about Bitcoin, I find this fascinating, is that Bitcoin is a really unique asset. We've actually never had anything like it ever in history. Every asset up until now has been either physical, so you've got houses, you've got gold, you've got precious, like you've got gems. Well, the problem with physical assets is they can be easily confiscated. The police can come up and they can basically tape around your house and say, cool, you can't access this anymore, we're going to confiscate your house. Or assets have been digital, and they've been held by third parties. So you've got stocks, you've got bonds, you've got derivatives, you've got cash in the bank, they're held by third parties. So the government can, if they want to, seize those assets. Well, Bitcoin is really unique because you can actually take custody of Bitcoin, but it's a digital asset. And so what that means is I could have 12 words in my head and have $1 billion of capital, and I can walk across a border, start naked, and no one has any idea that I have that capital in my head. And so all of a sudden, you dematerialize borders. Capital can flow to where value is being created. So if there's a nation state that is offering value to their populace, capital can flow to that nation state. If you own a house, if you own gold, it's very hard for you to move those assets to that nation. So effectively, you're under the thumb of government. Well, if capital can flow to where value is being created and capital can leave a country, it shifts the incentive from the politicians and the government, the people being subservient to the politicians and government, to all of a sudden, the government and the politicians being subservient to the people. They have to offer value to the people. Now, this is going to take time. It's not going to be something that's just going to happen overnight. But I think that as more people save in Bitcoin, it shifts the incentives, where all of a sudden the politicians have to listen to the people. Because if the people don't agree with what the politicians are doing, and you have an uprising and they refuse to pay taxes, the politicians, the government can no longer fund operations and they'll quickly wither away. So I think that it's a forcing free market function. And we've never had anything like that before. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the question is around like, what does the world look like in 2140 once all the Bitcoin has been mined and there's no more block subsidies? So what are the miners going to be incentivized by? And it's a really interesting question. And the first thing I'll answer is that I don't think we have all the answers right now. We can only theorize about this stuff. And human ingenuity, I'm confident that we're going to figure out a solid answer to that thing. However, if I was to theorize what's going to happen right now from my knowledge base, my limited knowledge base, it would be a couple different things. First off, if we have a global population transacting in Bitcoin, I don't think they're going to be transacting on the base chain. We're going to start to see much larger transactions, just like we have the Fed network, and then we have the interbank networks, and then we have credit cards and such. You're only seeing large transfers between on the Fed network and interbank networks. So we're not going to see huge transactions. So I don't actually think transaction fees are going to be enough to support miners. As a result, where are they going to be incentivized? Well, I think that all of a sudden the incentives shift, whereby if you're a nation state and you have a treasury that holds Bitcoin, well, you want to, one, ensure that that Bitcoin is not at risk. You want to be able to transact, ensure your transactions are processed. And so now the incentive shifts towards you being a miner to ensure that you can actually get your transactions processed. And so when you have nation states all over the world owning Bitcoin, they're going to be incentivized to run their own miners to ensure their transactions can be processed. Because the US miners could be like, I'm not going to process a Bhutanese transaction. I'm going to focus on American transactions. And on top of that, I think we're going to start to see it with a lot of corporate entities as well. If you've got a company like MicroStrategy is going to have an incentive to become a miner to ensure that its transactions are being processed. So I think we're going to see a shift in incentives in how mining actually functions. And on top of that, I think what we're also going to see is over the next 100 years, energy is going to become far more abundant. I believe, and maybe this is a little bit of a conspiracy theory, so I'm going to go down a rabbit hole right now for a second. There is an amazing documentary called The Lost Century. This documentary talks about how the US, in I think it was the 30s, put something out called the US Patent Secrecy Act. The US Patent Secrecy Act has 6,000 patents that have been basically suppressed, has been hidden from the public site. And these patents, the reason why they've been hidden is because they're deemed they will impact the economic viability of the US or the government and its position. So anything that it deems as potentially going to impact the economic viability of the government or some of these major corporations, they can suppress this technology. I believe we have already reached what is called 0-point energy, which is we have access to abundant energy without the need of going down traditional avenues of fossil fuels, nuclear, solar. We just don't have access to it from the public domain. So I think that over the next 100 plus years, and this is a big if, I think we're going to have abundant energy. Well, if we're starting to have abundant energy and energy is a fraction of the cost, well, it's going to be like running a node. If I'm an individual and I can run a node for a couple $100 and basically monitor the transactions or verify transactions, I can also mine very cheaply. And I'm not doing it for a monetary incentive, I'm doing it to protect the network. So I think we're also going to see a change in incentives as energy becomes a lot cheaper. Anyway, to answer that question.
Where can we find that documentary?
It's maybe on Rumble. I think I found it on Rumble. Yeah, it's called The Lost Century. It's really interesting. If anyone wants to go down conspiracy theories, I love them. Yeah. So this is a really good question, and the question is around is there a chance of kind of a centralization of coins or an oligarchy and a few small holders holding a large amount of coins? I would say if one of you guys, if I was to maybe reshape the question, it's what is one of my attack vectors that I believe could impact Bitcoin? And it is this. It is that something like BlackRock can be buying up Bitcoin right now, left, right, and center, because we're starting to see average individuals using an ETF as their vehicle to obtain Bitcoin. Now, what I think may happen in time is that as they accumulate more Bitcoin, they can create a fork of Bitcoin. And for those that aren't familiar, you've effectively got what's called a soft fork or a hard fork. They could do a hard fork, which could change the rules of Bitcoin in the favor of BlackRock. They could do a fork, change the rules in favor, and because they hold a large majority of the share, at the point of that fork, they effectively hold, let's say they hold 5 million Bitcoin. They will hold 5 million on both forked coins. They can dump the 5 million on the original Bitcoin and maintain their Bitcoin, forked Bitcoin, and that will massively impact the price of the original Bitcoin. I think that that is absolutely possible. However, I would push back and I'd say, in the long term, I think core Bitcoiners, people that understand what Bitcoin stands for, will understand that that is taking place. They will still hold that Bitcoin, and then Bitcoin will start to appreciate once again after it's recovered. It could take years. We don't know how long it was going to take. It could take years. But as Bitcoin starts to recover again, BlackRock no longer has that Bitcoin. They've just sold all of that Bitcoin. So I think that in the short term, when I say short term, I'm meaning after that dump has taken place, you could see a massive impact and a big impact to Bitcoin's price and a centralization of coins. We could see a chain that could fork, that could be, the rule set could benefit certain entities. But I think as long as there's a core ethos of Bitcoiners that stay true to the original premise, they're going to understand that that is taking place. So in the long term, I don't think it's a threat. It's more of a short-term threat. Yeah.
I actually just wanted to add to this gentleman's question.
I appreciate you sharing that, and I think that's a really good point. And one thing I'll add on top of that is that I do believe that we may see in the short term a centralization of coins to, whether it's Michael Saylor, whether it is these Bitcoin ETFs, one thing, turning off this alarm, we may see a centralization of these coins to these big entities. But what I'm also hoping is that as Bitcoin's price starts to appreciate, people have more capacity. As people have more capacity, they start to look inwards and they start to get curious about Bitcoin. Most people, when they go down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin, initially purchase it on an exchange, and then you see its price start to increase, and that increases your curiosity, and then you start diving down the rabbit hole, and you start to adopt some of these, the ethos of Bitcoin, self-sovereignty, accountability, honesty, and things like that. And so I think that Bitcoin changes people, and these ETFs can be a stepping stone for individuals to get into Bitcoin, and I'm hoping that in time we start to see more of the general populace get curious about what sovereignty means. And I think actually, adding to one more point, kind of building on this idea of like what would be an attack vector of Bitcoin, I think one of the biggest attack vectors of Bitcoin to me is actually, it's this, what is it? It's, there's a quote at the start of The Big Short, and it says, "It's not what you don't know that gets you in trouble, it's what you know that just ain't so." And it's a I think it's a phenomenal quote, because I think that if there was going to be something that creates a catastrophic failure of Bitcoin, I would say it's going to be the developers creating change to Bitcoin with unintended consequences. It is that we think we know what we're doing, and then we make some little tweak, and then all of a sudden it creates all of these repercussions. And so I would say that it's probably going to be us that makes a mistake, as opposed to some external thing coming in and attacking Bitcoin. Yeah. Any other questions?
So, given that, what's your take on op return?
Oh man.
Where do you stand?
For those that aren't familiar, maybe I'll give a little bit of backstory first. Raise a hand, how many of you guys are familiar with this op return debate that's going on in Bitcoin right now? Okay, there's a few hands going up. So for those that aren't familiar, in Bitcoin, and I may butcher this, I'm not a technical person, I'm more of a philosophical person. So in Bitcoin, in the code, there is something called the op return. And it's allowing you to put non-financial data into a transaction. So if you dig into Bitcoin, in the first ever transaction, Satoshi wrote, bankers on the brink of second bailout. You guys have seen this? So that message was stored in the op return. It's additional information. It's non-financial information. So he sent a message. This op return has a maximum size of, I think, 83 bytes of data. So you're limited in how much information you can store. Well, at the moment, there's a whole bunch of developers, Bitcoin Core, which are kind of like the core developers, are trying to push removing this limit on the Bitcoin op return. And basically the argument, if I was to simplify it, is there's a lot of individuals that want to use Bitcoin for non-monetary purposes, storing JPEGs, NFTs, you name it. And then there's a whole other bunch of Bitcoiners that are focused on Bitcoin. We want to make it the soundest monetary protocol. We recognize that NFTs on so many of these other altcoins have failed. So how do we actually just focus on money? And if people want to do NFTs, they can do it, but they do it on side chains, drive chains, second layers. Don't put it on the base layer. So the argument is that if they remove this op return, it allows them to how do I word this? I would say that at the moment, because there is a limit, 83 bytes of information can go into this op return, what ends up happening is you can't really store much information in there. So rather than storing JPEGs in the op return, they're storing it in other areas that are monetary transactions, and they're bloating the UTXO set, they're bloating the node. So if you're an individual and you are downloading the whole blockchain, you're having to download people's JPEGs. And most people don't want to do that. So they're saying that if you do this through the op return, then you're able to store data in the op return more effectively, and people are not going to store it in other areas. However, from my understanding, the op return is around like 3 or 4 times more expensive than storing it in the other areas. So I don't think, from my understanding, it's actually going to change anything. But from my limited technical understanding, I lean towards not changing the op return purely from the perspective, which I mentioned earlier, which is I think there's going to be unintended consequences of making changes, such as allowing an unlimited amount of space being taken up through non-monetary uses. So I lean towards keeping it at 83 bytes. That's my personal opinion. But that's not coming from a technical standpoint. I don't know if anyone has a better explanation, feel free to stand up. Maybe one more question? Anyone else? Absolutely. And I think that, so the question is around like, based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, even if you're holding Bitcoin, can you still get stuck on the base? And I think that there is always going to be people in any society, no matter what currency we're using, there's always going to be people that, whether it is they mismanage and they find themselves stuck on kind of the base layer, whether it is they've been through so much trauma in their life that they find themselves on the streets, whether it is they go down the wrong path. And I think we can never try to alleviate every single issue that we're facing in society. We can't alleviate all of the trauma. We can't alleviate some of the financial struggles and such. But I think that what Bitcoin does is the majority of people are a product of their environment. And because of that, how do we just create an environment that creates greater ease than the current environment, is the way I look at it. And so I think that if I was to put myself as an individual on Hastings, so for people that don't know, Hastings is one of the highest rates of homelessness in Canada, even in North America, and it's just a street that's not far from here, it's a few blocks. And if I was to put myself as one of those individuals and ask myself the question, would I rather be living in a world where things are getting more expensive, or would I rather be living in a world where things are getting less expensive? And I think that if you're living in that latter world, you have a greater probability of being able to get out of your situation. On top of that, I think that when you're living in the former world, where life is getting harder and harder and harder, you become far more reliant on subsidies. You've become far more reliant on government. And I think this isn't even just for homeless people. I think this is also just for everyday people. When we have a monetary system where life is getting harder, we become far more reliant on government to support us, and that can lead to these states of authoritarianism, totalitarianism. And so overall, I would say that when you have Bitcoin as a foundational layer and people have more capacity to show up, you may not alleviate it completely, but I think that you reduce that capacity for people to get stuck on the base layer, which they are today. And I think you reduce the chance of authoritarian, totalitarianism, things like that, where you have a whole swath of people that are subservient to the government because they're reliant on their subsidies. Hopefully that answered a little bit. Yeah. Anyway, I just want to say thanks a lot, you guys. I really appreciate everyone coming out.